Hello and welcome to this video in which we are going to analyze some of the movements of the guitar technique of Pepe Romero. Now, what can you say about Pepe that hasn't already been said? I think that no matter how many years go by, he's going to always be known as one of the greatest classical guitarists to ever live. His family has to be the most important family in terms of the development of the classical guitar. As I think I've said before, it's one thing to be a great player, it's a whole different thing to be a great teacher. And only the very rare, very special individual is both. And Pepe is certainly one of these people. And to me, he's also just one of the best examples of artistry first. I remember someone telling me before the first time I was going to see Pepe in concert, and I was talking to a friend at school, and they said, "Have you ever seen Pepe before?" And I said, "No." And they said, "Get ready to hear perfect guitar playing." So, prime Pepe, yeah, you really don't beat that in terms of the perfection, the polish that everything has, and of course the artistry. But when we look at his technique, it's interesting to see the things that work to make this amazing system that he utilizes when playing. So to jump right in, I want to start by looking at his sitting position a bit. This is a nice shot of him from the front, and you can see this is how he holds the guitar. I don't remember ever seeing an instance where he didn't hold the guitar this way. Now it's pretty traditionally based in terms of he does utilize the footstool. It's under his left foot, and the left foot is pretty elevated, right? It looks like that footstool might be on its highest setting. And this is always something that I see him use, is a very high footstool. Does make me wonder about the back over all the years, But usually, when someone uses a footstool under their left leg, the guitar is kind of centered and resting on the left leg. In fact, it's almost like the guitar was built that way, right? Because the crook of the guitar goes right on top of the thigh, and it just fits really nicely. But in Pepe's case, there's a little bit of a twist on it because he actually has either of the bouts resting on both of his legs. So on his left leg is where the upper bout sits, and the lower bout sits on his right leg. So in essence, the guitar is moved a little bit more to the right than it would be if the crook of the guitar was sitting straight on top of the leg. Of course, Pepe has extensive training not only in classical but also in flamenco. And flamenco players know all about the utilization of the arm up through the crook of the elbow and all the way up to the shoulder, and how to get the utmost of power out of that mechanism. So if the guitar were to be moved, several inches to his left by changing the sitting position, the way that whole mechanism would work would be different. And another thing about his sitting position, and this is something I always look for because some people do this, some people don't, is there is a slight angle with the guitar leaning back into the body. So we can see it really good from this shot here. This is from one of his teaching videos. So you can see the guitar doesn't sit totally upright. There is a decent angle actually of it leaning back into his body. So now I want to talk about his general free stroke hand position. And this is pretty interesting, observing somebody who has so much experience in two different styles. And although Pepe's sounds to me are pretty much predominantly classical, sometimes he does use the flamenco kind of clicky thumb sound, even in some of his classical pieces. But even his flamenco recordings are extremely smooth. But despite the fact that he has a gorgeous classical tone, when I look at his free stroke position, it does remind me a lot of flamenco. So this shape here, this is how my teacher, who was friends with Pepe by the way, and his family, this is how he taught general flamenco hand position. So this is kind of general for using the thumb and fingers in free stroke together, right? And he taught it by having a very flat wrist and then just sticking the thumb straight out. And the thumb plucks the strings very much on the side and goes straight down. And that looks pretty much like what Pepe is doing here with this general free stroke. And you can see the flatness of the wrist. The indicator for me for a flat wrist is when you look at the big knuckles, is there a line that's going up from the wrist to the big knuckles? If the line is going up, then it looks like the wrist is flat, or even more than that, but at least flat. Because if it's elevated, then it will be going the other way. It will be going down from a taller wrist to the knuckles. So that's what you see in his general free stroke hand position. You see him utilizing a flat wrist approach. And then the other thing that's interesting to me here is there's a heavy tilt towards his A finger, right? Some players are tilted heavily towards the thumb. Some people are tilted heavily towards the other side. Okay, he's definitely the latter. And you can see this because in this shot right here, it's basically straight on, right? Like straight in front of the guitar. And look how tilted his hand is. When you can start to see like the inside of the hand, like the inside of the index finger. Okay, that means the whole hand is kind of tilted towards the A finger. And something that makes a lot of sense when you have the wrist angle that he has. You can really take advantage of leaning towards that side of the hand with the flat wrist. The other thing that's really interesting to me about his free stroke, because I'm very fascinated by his free stroke. He has one of the best sounding free strokes, one of the loudest free strokes that you'll ever hear. So, how does he get this? Well, he breaks one rule that I know of, at least. Okay, so the rule I'm talking about, if you've ever heard the rule of follow through. So if you're doing free stroke, there's going to be a certain amount of follow through after you pluck the string, right? And this rule states that you should not follow through more than the next adjacent string, right? So this is a rule that Pepe does not adhere to really whatsoever. I mean, you may rarely see him do it. We actually will see him do it here in a minute. But when he's doing kind of a normal free stroke, which for him is like a huge free stroke, right? Huge sounding note. Then he's definitely going to have a healthy amount of follow through. So you can really see it here in this video. This is one of those teaching videos, and he's doing tremolo. And you can see a massive amount of follow through. Here he's playing slowly, he's playing under tempo to demonstrate some things. So it's not like he's going for maximum volume or anything like that, I would imagine. And yet, there is quite a bit of follow through. Another thing, still thinking about flamenco a little bit, is his fingers really curl into the palm, which you see a lot in flamenco. So you see the middle joint really being utilized a lot, and it looks like his A finger it might even be touching. I mean, if it's not, it's really close. And then his M and I fingers, they're not far behind. There's also a big movement up into the palm. But you can see the movement is well beyond what the next string might be. In this instance, it's like it would be the third string. It's much closer to maybe the fourth string. In this shot, you can see him utilizing a bunch of different techniques. And we're still talking about free stroke. So single notes, a few alternating passages, some chords, some arpeggios, things like that, right? And you see the same type of approach. Of course, you can see the flat wrist of the hand position and the leaning towards the A finger, which is going to kind of point the fingertips up in the first place. And then you see when he makes the strokes, he curls the fingers into the palm, and there is certainly a decent amount of follow through. And this is somebody that when he teaches, he really talks about relaxation. One of the things that I've heard him say many times is, your maximum speed is not how fast you can play, it's how fast you can relax. So he bases his technical approach on concepts like this. And yet, this amount of follow-through is necessary. One of the concepts that I think is always valid in videos like this is economy of movement. The only thing about economy of movement to me that's difficult is, what does it mean? Because you might hear some conflicting opinions about what it means. For some people, it means, well, don't move very much. For some people, it means, well, move as little as possible. But when you look at different players, I think it means you need to move the exact right amount. And that is economy of movement. If it's movement that's required to get the sound that you're looking for, it's not wasted. If it's movement that fits perfectly into your scheme and your technique, your system of relaxation and your execution, it is by definition absolutely necessary and vital, actually, for you to move that way to play the guitar. And just for a little bit of contrast, this is a shot of his plucking hand when he's playing a bit of a quieter passage. What you can see here is his follow-through is not here, right? So this might be an approach to like a piano passage or something like that, because you just barely see some movement of the fingers. Really, it just looks like his fingers are coming off the string more than anything. But you do not see the big follow-through that you see before. And yet, he still gets a decent amount of volume with even a stroke like this. So now I want to look a little bit at his rest stroke hand position, kind of how it changes. Of course, he has a brilliant rest stroke sound. Pepe is one of these people that he can play pretty much anything with rest stroke scales. I can think of so many examples of music where people use slurs or use three-finger technique, or what have you. And you listen to him play it, and he just plucks the whole thing, and he plays it all IM rest stroke. Absolutely phenomenal. So I think it's definitely worth taking a look at. Not to mention, I can't remember ever hearing him sacrifice his sound for the sake of speed. He can play an amazingly fast scale with, really I think it's the most finesse that I've ever heard. He just has a quality that I've never really heard anyone else duplicate. So in this shot here, I picked it to start because you can see him switching from free stroke to more of a rest stroke hand position. And he kind of transitions. It starts out free stroke, and then you see his wrist come up a little bit. He does some rest strokes, and then it comes up more. And so now he's in the rest stroke position with a taller wrist. So now that he has the taller wrist, you can see the line, instead of going up to the knuckles, now it goes down, signifying that taller wrist. But it's not a huge change. It definitely is a change, and we're going to talk a little bit more about changing the hand position and how frequently he does that here in a minute. But it's not like a giant thing. It's pretty subtle. I was actually surprised to see it not be visually all that different. It's just a slight shift, just a little bit of an elevation of the wrist, and basically that's it. What doesn't change really is the angle of his hand tilting towards the A finger. As far as I can tell, that basically stays the same. In other words, he doesn't start leaning towards the thumb when he switches to rest stroke. He stays with that angle of the finger being very much in front of the string, kind of on that other side of the hand, on the side of the hand that your pinky is and your A finger is. So that angle is maintained. And something interesting about his hand position for rest stroke scales is what I call the A finger tuck. So I can remember my teacher in a lesson one time talking to me about this. And he said, when people play IM rest stroke scales, they stick their pinky out or they let their A finger move around. And he said, nobody believes me that you should just kind of give it a slight tuck into your palm, and that's where it should live when you do rest stroke IM scales. But then he goes, well, there's one person that believes me, Pepe Romero, because he said Pepe plays scales that way, right? And he surely does. So you can see in this shot here, the A finger tuck, where it just kind of lives there. Doesn't look like it's holding a lot of tension, in this shot at least, but it's just slightly tucked. You can see it sticking out, behind the M finger, and that's kind of where it lives when he's playing his IM rest stroke scales. This shot from the front, I think is interesting because this is him playing the Aranjuez, the second movement, and this is one of those passages where it's a scalar passage and it ends with these ornaments on the top. And ornaments in which most people would slur, or at least use some slurs, but not Pepe. No, he says, I'm just going to pluck the whole thing. And so what is interesting here, if we're kind of focusing on the A finger, is it looks like as he plays some slower notes and then he gets to these ornaments which are faster, so he starts to kick it into the next gear, it looks to me like the A finger might tuck a little bit more. You can kind of see that the middle joint down when he starts the passage just slightly in this shot. And then as he kicks into the next gear with his speed, you see his M and I fingers, it looks like maybe they straighten out just a bit. And you don't really see that middle to tip joint of the A finger anymore. It looks like it kind of disappears back there. So perhaps a little bit more of a tuck as he increases his speed with the IM rest stroke scales. And this shot here I think is really interesting. This is something I connect to personally because I've really struggled with this. You know, when I play IM rest stroke scales, the tip joint of my middle finger is just the bane of that technique's existence. And on good days, I somehow know what to do with it. On bad days, I feel like I have no idea what to do with it. And I used to think it might be because, well, the M tip joint operates differently than my I tip joint, and maybe that's the problem. But then in this shot here, in which he's demonstrating really transparently his rest stroke technique, I realized, oh my god, he has more disparity between his I and M tip joints in the way that they move than I do. And if you hear him play a scale, it has an amazing homogeneous sound, right? It doesn't sound clunky like one finger and then the other finger. It just sounds like one tone of voice. But what you can see in this shot is his I finger, there's hardly, sometimes it's like there's none, but sometimes there's a slight collapse in the tip joint of the I finger, but just a little, okay? The M finger is different. It collapses a lot more. And this is such a cool shot because he's showing what happens after the stroke and then he kind of holds it. And you can see how much that joint bends. So it was really amazing for me to see, yeah, this guy has one of the best scale sounds, best scale techniques in the world. And his joints move very differently. So he has learned how to, I suppose, deal with the different movements of the joints in a way so that he can still combine them together to make one amazing scale sound. This shot here I just think is just one of the coolest shots for fingerstyle guitar that I've ever seen. And you know, when I was growing up there was no YouTube and you know, we didn't have access to things like this, and it would have blown my mind to see something like this as a kid, just so up close and personal at this ideal angle, an amazing player utilizing an amazing technique and just getting to see it so up close. So when I watch this, you know, my first thought is just fascination. You know, this is totally amazing. And just what a gift to be able to see one of the best guitarists to ever live, to see their technique so up close and personal. Just amazing. Of course, you can see here kind of what we've already talked about. You've got the A finger tuck going on. You can see the flexing of the tip joints. But what I thought was really interesting information about this shot was the movement of the string. So when I was watching this clip, and after I got over kind of just the sheer fascination of it, I started noticing the string and how it was moving. And it's just interesting to see when we slow it down, you can really see the string being depressed and then bouncing back, and then quickly being depressed and then bouncing back. And with this shot here, you can just kind of sense the effect of the tone, because you see this string having a massive vibration. I mean, it looks like it turns into a giant string is what it turns into after it's plucked. but it's only for a split second and then it's being pressed and then released again. So just really cool to see what's happening to the string here on a very up close and personal level. And then one last thing about rest stroke technique here. In Pepe's lesson videos, he does talk about when he plays rest stroke on the treble strings, he puts his thumb on the 6th string and he pushes down. And he demonstrates that, right? So this is one of those long scale passages in the Aranjuez second movement where it ends with the rapidly plucked ornaments. So throughout this whole passage, he has the thumb resting on the 6th string and kind of pressing a little bit here and there. But then, as he increases the speed, you see his thumb press more and more consistently, kind of hold down in that area while he's playing the fast passage. So that's kind of the technique that he talks about in action. But I also notice, and I think this is just kind of cool, to me this is probably just a feel thing, but when he starts this passage, there's a moment in which he presses down on the 6th string with his thumb when he's not playing a note. It kind of reminded me of maybe a basketball player shooting a free throw, and before they shoot, they bend their knees once or twice, just like, okay, I'm about to get ready to do the thing, and this is part of what I'm going to use. So he's sustaining a note, and within that gap where the right hand is not really doing anything, he just does this move where he presses down on the 6th string, pretty firmly. You can see it move. So we've talked some about free stroke and some about rest stroke and some about thumb. But in these passages here, I thought they really just demonstrated Pepe's ability to move his plucking hand around. Sometimes you will hear people talk about not utilizing a particular technique because they don't want to move their hand. The only reason I could possibly think to do something like that would be that you would decrease your likelihood of making a mistake. If you don't have to move your hand around, if you know you're in the exact same position, seems more likely that you'll be accurate. But Pepe's a player to look to say, yeah, Pepe can play as perfect gets, but he's never going to compromise getting a particular sound out of the guitar. So I just thought that these passages were a good mix of a bunch of different techniques. And the only reason I could think of that somebody might change their hand position to get a different sound is because you have to. Because that you can get that sound, and even if the change makes the sound 4% more of a particular quality, then it's worth it, because that you got all that you could get out of that sound, and that the effect was as effective as it could be. So just to break down a few of the changes here, in this passage, he starts out with a tall wrist thumb position. This is not his typical free stroke position because you've got the elevated wrist, which can lead to a bigger sound for the thumb, right? And he changes between that hand position and then a flatter wrist, kind of moves the wrist in to do some free stroke, going back and forth between these two. In this clip here in the same piece, he goes between free stroke with the thumb and fingers, kind of his typical look for free stroke, and then he switches to rest stroke. So elevates the wrist a bit and changes the angle that his thumb attacks the string at. By the way, the thumb, instead of being on the side, it's kind of more on top of the string. Straightens out the fingers and does some rest strokes on the treble strings, and then finishes everything up with some free strokes. So this is something that I always appreciate. People who have no fear, have no concern for really any type of movement, and who will do whatever they have to do to achieve their sounds. So I have one more plucking hand technique to look at before we move on to the fretboard hand. And it's a very sneaky technique. So one of the things that you will see Pepe utilize from time to time is the very sneaky eye drag. So, if you're ever trying to teach someone to be able to do exclusive alternation, don't show them any of these clips. Because they very well may say, well, Pepe doesn't do exclusive alternation, so why should I have to? And this is a technique that I really have never been able to figure out. So in case this is new to you, the eye drag technique is when, instead of doing a string crossing, like doing I on one string and then doing M on the string below it, you just do I on the top string and then I. You keep dragging it on the string underneath it. And it only works in descending passages, of course. And I have a few different instances where he's using it. So this passage here is kind of like a mid-tempo passage, and there's a number of different free stroke fingerings you could utilize here, and he just kind of bypasses them all and heavily relies on the eye drag. And what's interesting is he does a couple of them, and for the first one there's a slur in between the two notes, so you've got a little bit more time, but it's still the same technique. And then he does a middle finger stroke, and then follows the whole thing up with 3 I notes in a row. He does rest stroke I on second string, rest stroke I on third string, and then free stroke I on fourth string. That's a pretty big drag with the I finger. In this instance here, he's playing a scale passage from the Adagio of the Aranjuez concerto. And this is at the end of the second kind of entry of the theme, after we have it the first time, and it's the part that everybody sings, and then the next time it comes back in. At the end of that passage, there's this scale passage, which I've always found really tricky. I've never found a really effective way to finger it, and I just kind of consider it an exercise in some difficult string crossings. But I never thought of doing something like this. So he just skips all those difficult string crossings, and instead of having to do anything like that, he just throws in the I drag. And I've slowed it down here so you can see. There's 2 different instances where he will play a note on an upper string with I, and then just drag the finger and immediately play the next note on the string below it with I. It first happens between strings 1 and 2, and then happens between strings 3 and 4. It's really an ingenious way to totally eliminate some very tricky string crossings. So now moving on to the fingerboard hand, and there's a few different things here that I want to look at. Ever since I can remember, I always thought Pepe's fretboard hand had a very distinctive look. It just looked very unique. And I think a big part of that is what I'm going to talk about here, which I call the third finger stick. So in this series, we have seen players sometimes stick out a finger on their fretboard hand, but we've never seen anyone who sticks out their third finger. And one of the things that I realized when watching Pepe play is that this is just part of his fretboard hand position. Maybe about half of the time, maybe more, his third finger is sticking out above his other 3 fingers. And in all of these shots, it's what you can see. His third finger is above the other fingers when it's not being used. I especially like this shot because probably obviously the cameraman is thinking, let's get a close-up of Pepe's face and try and see his concentration or whatever. But what this is a great example of that you can see is his third finger sticking out above the other fingers. That's all you can see is just his fretboard hand fingertips. And you see that third finger noticeably taller than the others. I mean, it's like a whole tip joint taller than the other fingers. And you can especially see it when he does passages using 1, 2, and 4. So he's using every finger except the third finger. In those instances, you can really see that third finger hanging out and kind of sticking straight up. And what's really interesting about this to me is that many people teach, and a lot of people play this way, where your ready position for your fretboard hand needs to employ all of your tip joints already being curled. I suppose theoretically so that they just only have to go straight down, right? But Pepe's ready position is not that way. His ready position involves the third finger just almost slightly being extended. And then when he needs to call upon it, well, of course, it knows right where it needs to go and it has no problem getting there. But it's just a little bit of a different move. Instead of being already curled and coming straight down, it comes from a slightly extended position. This, I think, is a really interesting shot of the third finger at work, because you can see when he needs to use it, it comes down. Of course, it ends up being curled like his other fingers. But when he doesn't need to use it, it's sticking pretty far up there. And it's decently far away from the fingerboard of the guitar. You know, in guitar distances, we're talking like centimeters here. That can make a big difference. But he's pretty far away with both the third and the fourth finger. Actually, you can see in this passage that they have to travel a decent ways. And I look at instances like this and I just think, you know, sometimes you hear really great sounding rules about playing the guitar and they make a lot of sense. The rule of keep all your fingers curled on the fretboard hand, and when you're not playing a note, they're hovering right above the strings ready to go. I mean, that makes so much sense. But in real life, sometimes things don't work that way. Sometimes there's just a better way. I don't think someone like Pepe would do anything that didn't work into the most efficient way that he knew how to play the guitar and be an artist. So when you see a principle like this at work, in other words, fingers being further away from the guitar than you think they might need to be, what it says to me is there's something he's utilizing that allows him to play at his level that he would not be able to use as effectively if he were to use any other type of hand position. Here I want to look at a few different instances of vibrato. And there are other players that I have seen do this, but Pepe was the first one that I ever heard about. I heard someone mention, you know, when Pepe does vibrato, he lifts his thumb off the back of the neck. So here is a clip in which you get a good shot of this, because he plays a few fretted notes, and then you can see he does the vibrato, lifts the thumb, and then, you know, sets it down, plays a note, does some more vibrato. So you get to see him going back and forth. And I've seen people do this kind of to a large degree, where their arm really comes forward and things like that. What he's doing here is just a slight lift, right? So it looks like just as long as there's no anchor there, then perhaps that's what he needs to be able to move and achieve his vibrato. So it was pretty interesting for me to see, yeah, he does indeed do this, but just barely. Just a slight lift will achieve the effect. This instance here I thought was really cool, because if you just hear this chord and you hear the nice vibrato on top, you're like, wow, that sounds pretty. But if you weren't watching, you might not guess that it's a bar chord. And he's not only doing gorgeous vibrato, but he's doing it with bar chord technique. So that just really blows my mind. You can hear his amazingly crafted vibrato in the midst of a bar chord, making such a beautiful effect. And since we did just talk about the thumb, kind of cool to see in this instance, he doesn't lift the thumb. He's got the thumb pressed against the back of the neck, which for a bar chord, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I also thought it was really cool, if you slow this down, you can see the individual oscillations. And you can count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and maybe 5.5. Something like that, okay? I have heard people talk about vibrato in the sense that it should never be willy-nilly. every move that you do should be planned and coordinated. And so if you're thinking that way, I think that looks like what's happening here. When you see it in real time, it's kind of too fast for you to notice or to count the moves. But when you slow it down, it looks extremely planned. It makes you wonder if he might be coming from a place like that. He knows exactly how many times to oscillate, exactly how many times to move his hand. And when I watch great players do vibrato, I always like to look at their arm and at their shoulder and just try and see, where the move is coming from. For many people, it comes from their shoulder and then does travel up through the forearm and through the wrist. And I do think that's what we see here. Of course, you see the wrist and then the forearm, even though it's just the top of it in the shot, moving back and forth. But you can also just barely see the material on his shirt around the shoulder area move some. You can just barely see it. So that tells me, yeah, it looks like it's also coming from the shoulder. And it's that whole mechanism that helps give him his vibrato technique. And then one more thing about vibrato, and this is a moment that I get really excited about, because when you study great players, you never know what you're going to find. And this is something I heard someone talk about years ago, and I kind of forgot about it. And I was watching this video because he's talking about his rest stroke technique here. That's what this video is about. But then I noticed, these are some more scale passages from the second movement of the Aranjuez. And at the end, you hold out the last note for a bit, and he does vibrato. Probably without even thinking about it, right? He's not talking about vibrato here. He's talking about the scale technique. And I saw him do it, and I just thought, well, that looks weird. The movement looks different. And then I started to look at it closer, and you tell me, what kind of shape does it look like he's making with his arm and hand as he does the vibrato here? To me, it's a circle. And I thought this was really astounding. So if you slow this down and look at all the parts of his body, okay, look at his elbow. That does not look like back and forth to me. It looks like round. It looks like round and round. And if you kind of look at his bicep area, you see it wiggle that way. It's also a little bit of up and down, okay? And then the forearm kind of looks like it's doing the same thing, okay? Kind of interesting. You can see his watch wiggle around as his arm moves. And then the thumb area, I think that's what really gives it away. You can see the circular motion there, and then it goes all the way up to the fingertips. And if you focus on the knuckles and the fingertips, it looks like they're moving in a circle. The sound also kind of struck me. In other words, I just thought, that doesn't sound like normal vibrato, or it doesn't sound like a vibrato that I usually hear. And if you listen to the sound, it does have a special type of sparkle to it. So I thought that was really interesting. Definitely a more involved movement than your typical side-to-side vibrato. So in this shot here, Pepe is playing some left-hand only passages. This is him playing a version of the Malagueña. And first of all, let me just say, so he's playing left hand only, so there's no right, you're not going to hear any right hand. And listen to this type of sound that he can generate with only the fretboard hand. Yeah, that is macho right there. Just a monstrous fretboard hand technique to get this type of sound out. But beyond that, what I was struck by is his second finger tip joint. So Pepe in general, I really can't remember really any instance in which he doesn't utilize the curved tip joints. That seems to be a fundamental part of his technique. He does that consistently. Tip joints always curled and firm and not collapsing or anything like that. But one of the things that he does to get this monstrous slur sound is you see a big flexing of the tip joint of the second finger on his fretboard hand. And if you look at his fourth finger here, I don't see that in the fourth finger. The fourth finger looks like the tip joint is firm and it really doesn't move at all as that finger comes off the string. But each time he does a descending slur with the second finger, you see a big flexing of the tip joint. You know, it also reminds me of what my teacher would say about the sound of a slur. And he would say, you have to relax the tip joint of your fretboard hand finger when you execute the slur, or you're going to get a stiff sounding slur. And so perhaps that's kind of what's going on here. Or perhaps it gives him some kind of extra power to drive the sound since there's no right hand involved. But regardless, just a cool instance, I think, of seeing him do something that, you know, I don't remember seeing him do in any other instance. But this is a particular scenario, you know, one hand only, and this is how he pulls it off. So that's basically all that we're going to talk about here, although I do have one more bonus thing for you. And I'm not sure if this is really a thing, but I saw it and then I just became fascinated with it. So you can decide, or maybe you know the answer and you can fill the rest of us in. So at this point I was studying his fretboard hand technique, okay? And I want to show you this shot first to preface what I'm going to say next. Okay, so in this shot, look at the length of his fretboard hand fingers, and specifically the first, second, and third finger. So you see what looks like a pretty normal disparity in length between those fingers, right? This is pretty normal. They look maybe closer together than most people, but in general, that's how people's hands are. The M finger is the longest, the I and A are a little bit shorter, and they're kind of the same length, okay? And there's an angle of the camera here and the angle at which he's sitting, so I'm not exactly sure how much of the evenness comes across in the shot, right? But it looks like in this shot, the lengths of his fingers are normal, okay, in terms of their disparity. But then I noticed these next two shots. So these next two shots that I'm going to freeze on, they are in mid-performance, but he's not playing anything. He's in between positions, okay? So he's moving from one shape to the next. His hand is totally relaxed, and then he's about to go somewhere and fret the next shape, okay? Look at the length of his first, second, and third finger. You could put a pencil on the tip of those fingers and it would be perfectly balanced. They look exactly the same length. Once I started looking for it, I found this other shot and you see the same thing. Okay, same instance. He's going from one shape to the next, but he's in the middle of playing. And they look exactly the same length. So I think based on the very first shot that we saw, that there is a little bit of disparity between the length of these three fingers, but perhaps his ready position has them curled in such a way that they are all exactly the same length. I've never thought about, do all the fingers line up in a particular way? But once I saw that, I thought, well, theoretically, if this was the case, then all these fingers would be coming from the exact same distance, and who knows, it might be a huge advantage. Or, you know, like I said, maybe it's just trickery of the camera angle. But once I found it, I just thought, that is really crazy, and I've never seen anything like that before. And I found it in the one shot, and so I thought, well, maybe it's just how it looked in that shot. But then I found it again, and I thought, oh, okay, I don't know. There might be something to this here. I don't know if he's just genetically this way, or this is the way that he holds his hand, so that everything has to come from the same distance. But regardless, I thought it was something interesting and made a good bonus fact. So that is all that we're going to talk about here. I have probably any information that you might need listed in the description. There you'll find links to all the videos that I use footage from to make this video, and I would no doubt recommend going to those and listening to Pepe's performances. A big thank you to everybody that watches these videos and shares their insight via the comments. I've learned so much awesome information from people who know some of these people personally or have taken classes with them and have shared their insight and experience. I learn a lot of really cool stuff that way. Also in the description is a playlist of all these technique analysis videos if you want to check out some other people that we've looked at. And you never know what's going to happen in the future, but I do have plans to keep making these and to cover a lot of people. Thanks again for watching, and have a wonderful day.